I was strolling through the aisles at Costco and I found that they had keto bread. Now, I had heard people talking about it before, and a couple people had asked me to do sort of a review or a breakdown on the ingredients. And I thought about doing it, but then when I pulled this off the shelf and I saw what was actually in it, I figured, well, it's my duty to break down the ingredients and teach people so that they can make an educated decision. So we're gonna break down what the heck is in this keto bread. And I will go ahead and say, this in no way, shape, or form is designed to bash anything or bash any brand. It's purely looking at the ingredients and breaking down scientific research that I'm aware of. You do whatever you want with your diet. Take this as informational purposes only. Before I dive into the science, I do want to give a huge shout out to Magic Spoon. Okay, Magic Spoon is a keto cereal. So they're a low carb cereal that works for, well, just about any kind of dietary protocol. So I highly, highly recommend it. They're a big sponsor of this channel, and there's a special link down below. I love it because I'm able to have an actual cheat meal. And believe it or not, some of the cheat meals that I crave are just like a big bowl of cereal. Like I would love to just be able to dive into a bowl of Captain Crunch, but I'm obviously not going to do that. So this stuff is definitely changing the game for me. So highly recommend you check them out after you watch this video. Okay, let's go ahead and let's dive into these ingredients. So here's the thing. As keto gets more popular, we're going to see a lot of brands that just continue to jump on the bandwagon, right? But they don't necessarily do the research. They don't know about the ketogenic community. They don't know what's good. They don't look at the research. They don't look at the peer-reviewed science. They just make something that fits the macros, so to speak, which is exactly what we do not want in the ketogenic world. So anyhow, let's start with the first ingredients. We've got a bread base that has modified wheat starch, wheat gluten. Okay, so here's the thing. Modified wheat starch technically doesn't have gluten, or it does, but it's in such a small parts per million, it's negligible. But when we have actual wheat gluten in there, then we run into an issue. Now, if you watch my channel, you know that I harp on gluten all the time, but let me just phrase something simply here. When you're doing a ketogenic diet, one could argue that the biggest benefit you're getting is the modulation of inflammation. Okay, multiple studies show inhibition of nuclear factor kappa B, inhibition of what's called the NLRP3 inflammasome. What that simply means is that ketones, or when you're doing a low carb diet, you have a modulation of inflammation, which is largely responsible for probably how good you feel and the overall like water retention that you lose and things like that. So when you introduce things that are inflammatory or potentially inflammatory, you're doing yourself a disservice. And we have to remember that with a ketogenic diet, it's not necessarily the influx of ketones that are helping us. Maybe it's the removal of certain things, right? When you're doing a keto diet, you're generally not eating gluten. You're generally not eating grains. And if you do, they're such a small amount. So when it's the first ingredient here, it kind of scares me a little bit. So here's a little science on gluten for just a second. When you ingest gluten, there is a protein in it called gliadin, and that is the main issue, okay? So what happens is when you start to digest this gliadin, you start to digest this gluten, you have an increase of a protein in your body that's called zonulin. Totally natural response. But what zonulin does in high amounts is it triggers the tight epithelial junctions within your gut to break apart a little bit. Well, this means that you have an unnatural gap with your intestinal lining, with your epithelial cells, meaning things can pass into the bloodstream more. When things pass into the bloodstream, like larger chunks of protein from gluten and gliadin, well, that can trigger an inflammatory response via lipopolysaccharides and all kinds of other things. But more importantly is sort of this enzymatic downstream reaction. I'm going to get to the other ingredients in just a second, but trust me, this is really important. Okay, so when that gliadin gets broken down, it gets broken down by an enzyme called transglutamase, or Tgase2. Okay, this Tgase2 comes in and it breaks down the gliadin. When it does that, it turns the gliadin into something that is highly immunogenic. Okay, so you're breaking down a protein and making that protein so it has a more intense effect on your immune system. But also factor in that now this protein can get into the bloodstream a lot smoother than it was supposed to. So all of a sudden you have this potentially inflammatory thing getting into the bloodstream, so that causes your immune system to react. Well, what ends up happening is you have such an increase in these enzymes that are breaking down the protein that the body says, whoa, 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 put on the brakes for a second, and it triggers antibodies to fight the enzyme. Yeah, you heard me right. The very same enzyme that is there to break down the protein ends up just increasing so much that the body has no choice but to trigger an antibody response in some cases. Well, this antibody response can also affect what are called anti-TPO antibodies. So if you are someone that suffers from an autoimmune condition or thyroid issues, you could end up having an issue with this. And I'm rambling, but the point here is that why? Why? Why gluten? Why gluten? You could have used cornstarch even, and that would have been better. Anyhow, I digress. Let's talk wheat starch for just a second. I will say, to go on record, wheat starch does not have nearly as much gluten or any gluten. Okay, so that's not the problem. It's more so about the protein from the wheat itself. Okay, moving into the next thing. Okay, so we have a bread base of modified wheat starch, wheat gluten. Then we have inulin or chicory root vegetable fiber, oat fiber, and wheat protein isolate. Once again, there, wheat protein isolate, isolating the protein from the wheat. Not exactly good when we just determined that the protein is the actual issue. But then we look at chicory root. Okay, chicory root has been demonstrated to be a very fast fermenting fiber, faster than other fibers. So if you eat specific fibers when you're on a ketogenic diet, like you see them, acacia, inulin, chicory root, things like that, it can make you bloated. Now, studies have demonstrated that you can have up to about 10 grams before you start having an issue. Well, there's 12 grams of chicory root in a slice of this stuff. So that indicates that if you're having 2 slices, like a sandwich or something like that, that you're going to get 20 to 24 grams of chicory root, which is largely above what's been demonstrated in studies. So the Journal Academy of Nutrition is the publication that demonstrated this. Up to 10 grams, people might have a little bit of mild bloating, but over 10 grams of chicory root, and it's pretty uncomfortable. So 12 grams per slice, do the math. Now, there's even some companies out there. Okay, there's one particular company that I'm sure you've heard of before. Their name starts with Q, but I'm not going to actually name names. Even they pulled chicory root out of their products because they saw it was fermenting so fast and causing so much gastric distress. My point is, I don't think these guys did their homework. Wheat gluten, chicory root, you're already going to, you guessed it, bloat city. But now I'm going to get to the stuff that's even more concrete and really rooted in science. And again, I hate bagging on products, but I just have to be honest, okay? So we look at, soybean oil. That's the main fat they're using here. Okay, now there's not a ton of fat, but the fact that soybean oil is being used scares me. Okay, soybean oil is over 50% polyunsaturated fat coming from omega-6s. Okay, now omega-6s are already seemingly pro-inflammatory based upon the research, but soybean oil is a polyunsaturated fat that is relatively unstable, or shouldn't say relatively, it's very unstable. What this means is when you ingest it and it gets acted upon by oxygen, it goes through what's called lipid peroxidation. It's fairly widely known in a lot of the scientific community that soybean oil is a fragile oil that can trigger a lot of issues. Now, additionally, there's also evidence that shows that soybean oil is highly estrogenic. It's a phytoestrogen. Again, things you're trying to avoid on a ketogenic diet, right? So basically what happens with a polyunsaturated fat is it's very easy for it to oxidize, okay? Now, there's some omega-6s and some polyunsaturated fats that are good. Fish oil is an omega-3 polyunsaturated fat. Very, very good, but like I've talked about before, if you leave fish on the table, it's gonna rot and it's gonna smell, right? Exactly. Okay, now imagine that with soy, which is largely inflammatory too. Point is, why did we use soybean oil? It just doesn't make sense. And even to extract soybean oil out of the soy in the first place, they use hexane, which is a known neurotoxin. That's a process to get soybean oil created. So it's a neurotoxin, but then it's also heated to a very high temperature, which by itself oxidizes the soybean oil. So before the soybean oil is even getting in your body and potentially being acted upon, it's already oxidized. But then there's one thing in here that we definitely have to touch on, and that's fully hydrogenated soybean oil. Oh no, now we went the hydrogenated route. So here's what we have to remember. Fats that are unstable usually don't sit on the shelf for a long period of time because, well, they're unstable, especially in something like bread, which isn't sealed in a can. So what do? They hydrogenate it. That makes it a trans fat. Now, this isn't partially hydrogenated oil like you might see in peanut butter. This is fully hydrogenated, which means they've taken soybean oil and they've injected hydrogen into it to turn it into a saturated trans fat so that it can be more shelf stable. Well, we know based on what the Heart Association has said and everything that trans fats are not good. That is like first grade, avoid trans fats. But let's talk about what it does as far as prostaglandins are concerned with the inflammatory response within your body. Trans fats can block what are called 1 and 3 prostaglandins. 1 and 3, prostaglandins 1 and 3, are there to promote an anti-inflammatory effect. Okay, they fight inflammation. Then we have what are called prostaglandins 2, or type 2. Type 2 prostaglandins promote inflammation. Now remember, inflammation is not bad. It's only bad when it's in an excess. So we have this type 2, which promotes inflammation, and type 1 and 3 that kind of keep it in the rails, right? Well, it turns out that trans fats block type 1 and 3. So they block the prostaglandins that combat inflammation, but they allow type 2. Now, here's what else is interesting. Ketogenic diet. Okay, type 2 prostaglandins are largely fed by red meat, by dairy, cheese, things like that, right? Again, not bad when you have the sort of corralling effect of type 1 and 3 to control it. Well, you're eating red meat, you're eating cheeses, okay? You're doing the ketogenic diet. But then you just inhibited types 1 and 3 prostaglandins. So now all the red meat and all the cheese and dairy that you're eating is just going, well, sky high because it's affecting this prostaglandin 2, but you don't have the inhibition of it coming from type 1 and 3 because of the trans fats. I'm not saying this is magically going to happen as soon as you eat bread. It's not going to happen as soon as you eat this. Point is, if you consume a lot of these trans fats, it can promote an inflammatory response within the body. So is this going to fit your macros for keto? Yes, it's going to fit your macros for keto, and you have to make a decision for you based on you. Is it a tasty product? It probably really is. I'm not going to take a bite of it. Okay, I'm not trying to bash the company. In fact, hopefully they can use this and maybe even better their product. Okay, I'm all about trying to promote a healthy lifestyle. I also just make sure that I get the science out there whenever I can. So as always, do make sure you keep it locked in here on my channel. And don't forget to check out one of our sponsors, Magic Spoon, down below in the description after you watch this video. See you tomorrow.